In the Middle Ages, to speak of a road was to speak of something uncertain, something that could change from month to month, or even from day to day. A road could be as simple as a dirt track worn into the earth by centuries of feet and hooves, or as impressive as a broad, cobbled highway built long ago by the Romans. But no matter how it began, every road carried the weight of history, of countless journeys taken before yours, and countless risks still to come. If you stood at the edge of a medieval road in spring, you might see a ribbon of pale earth stretching between hedgerows, the surface softened by weeks of rain. Puddles would gather in the deep wheel ruts left by merchant carts, and the air would smell of wet soil and crushed grass. In winter, the same road could be almost unrecognizable, its edges blurred beneath snow, its path hardened to icy ridges where hooves had passed. Not all roads even looked like roads. Some were nothing more than faint lines across open fields, visible only because the grass there had been flattened over time. Others wound through forests so thick and shadowed that you could walk for hours in the gloom without ever glimpsing the sun. Travelers learned quickly that a path could vanish entirely, swallowed by mud, blocked by a fallen tree, or rerouted by a swollen stream. Near major towns, things were different. There, the best-maintained roads showed the hand of ancient engineering, wide stretches of stone carefully fitted together, designed to last centuries. These Roman-built routes were the pride of their regions, but they were rare. For most of a journey, a traveler would be lucky to find a track that was even passable for a cart. And then there were the bridges. Some were sturdy stone arches, built to endure floods and heavy wagons. Others were little more than rough logs lashed together, slick with moss and threatening to shift under your feet. Crossing a river in the Middle Ages was not always guaranteed. A bridge might have been washed away by last month's storm, or dismantled for repairs, leaving you to find a ford or pay for a ferryman. Travelers soon learned that the road was not a fixed thing. It was a living, shifting part of the land, shaped by weather, by war, by the choices of people who came before you. A season of rain could turn a safe route into a quagmire. A war could cut off an entire stretch with no warning. Even a change in local politics could see toll gates raised where there had been none before. Yet despite the hardships, the roads were the veins of medieval life. Without them, there could be no trade between distant markets. No pilgrim could reach a holy site. No messenger could carry news of peace or war. Every sack of grain, every barrel of ale, every letter sealed with wax, all of it depended on those twisting, uneven tracks. For a villager, stepping onto the road meant stepping into the unknown. The moment your home vanished from sight behind you, you entered a place where you could not predict what lay ahead. You might meet a friendly farmer offering bread, or a hungry stranger with a knife. You might find shelter in a warm inn, or be forced to sleep beneath the trees while wolves howled nearby. And yet, the road had its own rhythm. It taught you when to push forward and when to wait out the weather. It showed you that the fastest way was not always the safest, and that a mile gained could be worth more than gold if you reached it unharmed. It made you notice the world, the sound of cartwheels ahead, the sudden silence of birds in the trees, the scent of smoke carried on the wind. In the Middle Ages, the road was not just a path between places. It was a test of awareness, of patience, and of endurance. Every traveler who set foot upon it carried with them the quiet understanding that the road could be friend or enemy, savior or trap, and that survival meant respecting its power. Not everyone in the Middle Ages had reason to leave the place where they were born. For many people, life was lived within a few miles of home, with the farthest journey being to the nearest market or church. But there were always those who had to travel, and the roads were shaped by their footsteps and their needs. Merchants were some of the most frequent travelers, moving goods between villages, towns, and major trading centers. A merchant might set out with a cart full of wool to sell in one town, return with barrels of salt fish from another, and then make the journey again the following season. Their travel was not a matter of leisure, it was their livelihood, and every trip carried the risk of loss. A bandit attack could mean not only the end of their goods, but the end of their business entirely. Yet trade was essential, and so merchants became a constant presence on the roads, learning the safest routes, the most reliable inns, and the villages where a stranger could expect fair treatment. Pilgrims formed another large group of travelers. These were people making journeys to sacred places, sometimes only a few miles away, but often across entire kingdoms. They walked to shrines believed to hold relics of saints, to churches where miracles were said to occur, or to great destinations like Santiago de Compostela in Spain or Canterbury in England. Pilgrimage was both a spiritual duty and, for some, a chance to see parts of the world they might never have visited otherwise. But it was not without danger. Pilgrims traveled slowly, on foot, often without weapons, and they carried enough coin to pay for food and lodging along the way, making them tempting targets for thieves. For safety, they tended to move in groups, and the sight of a cluster of travelers with pilgrim badges pinned to their cloaks was a common one along the more famous routes. Messengers and envoys were also familiar figures on the road. In a time without telephones or quick communication, the only way to send urgent news was to entrust it to someone who could carry it in person. Royal messengers, church officials, and even hired runners were responsible for delivering letters, treaties, orders, and announcements across great distances. The speed of their journey could determine the outcome of political events or military campaigns, so they often traveled with official documents granting them safe passage. But paper protections could only do so much. In lawless regions, a messenger was just another traveler to rob. There were also craftsmen and skilled workers who traveled in search of employment. A stonemason might move from one construction site to another, working on a cathedral in one city before heading to a castle in another. Itinerant performers, jugglers, musicians, storytellers, wandered from fair to fair, earning coins from their art. Soldiers on leave, monks sent to different monasteries, and students heading to the early universities in cities like Paris or Bologna all joined the steady stream of humanity on the move. Sometimes the road carried those who were not free to choose their journey. Prisoners being marched to trial or punishment, peasants ordered to deliver goods for their lord, or displaced families forced from their land by war or famine, all became part of the landscape of medieval travel. For them, the road was not an adventure or an opportunity. It was a necessity dictated by forces they could not control. Seasonal movement added to the flow. Shepherds might drive their flocks to new grazing lands when the weather changed, while villagers traveled to distant markets for yearly fairs that brought together traders from across regions. These fairs were not only commercial events but social gatherings, and for some people, they were the only time in the year when they would see such a mix of strangers and hear news from beyond their valley. Every traveler, regardless of their reason for being on the road, had to think about survival. Even the wealthiest noble, riding with a retinue of armed men, faced the unpredictability of weather, illness, or accident. And for the poorest peasant or pilgrim, the danger was constant and close: a wrong turn into an unfamiliar forest, a sudden storm cutting off the path ahead, or a meeting with people whose intentions were anything but kind. What connected all of them was that to travel in the Middle Ages was never simply to move from one place to another. It was to step into a world where every mile held a question mark, and where the decision to take to the road was a decision to accept uncertainty, hardship, and risk in exchange for the chance to reach a destination that mattered deeply to them. For any traveler in the Middle Ages, the dangers of the road were never far from mind. The first and most feared threat came from bandits and highwaymen. These were not always desperate loners hiding behind trees with a dagger in hand. Sometimes they were organized gangs who knew the terrain intimately, selecting ambush points where the road narrowed or where a bend in the path hid them from view until it was too late. Travelers moving alone, especially those carrying visible goods, were at particular risk. Even armed guards were not a guarantee of safety, as a determined bandit group could outnumber and overpower a small escort. Roads that passed through deep forests, abandoned stretches of countryside, or between steep hills were notorious for such attacks, and certain regions gained lasting reputations as dangerous ground where caution was essential. Wild animals added another layer of danger, especially in more remote areas. Wolves, still common in parts of medieval Europe, could be a threat to lone travelers or to livestock being driven along the road. In some regions, bears were known to wander into settled areas, especially when food was scarce in winter. Even animals that posed less direct danger, like wild boar or packs of stray dogs, could cause serious injury if startled or cornered. At night, the problem worsened. Without the benefit of torches or fire, travelers could find themselves surrounded by sounds they could not identify, with no way of knowing whether danger was moving closer. Weather was another constant hazard. In the absence of modern forecasting, a traveler could set out under clear skies only to be caught in a sudden downpour or snowstorm hours later. Heavy rain could transform a road into a river of mud, slowing carts to a halt and making walking exhausting. Snow could obscure paths entirely, hiding both the way forward and any dangers along it. Flooded rivers could make bridges impassable, forcing long detours that added days to a journey. Even in good weather, the summer sun could become an enemy, causing dehydration and heat exhaustion for those unprepared. Illness and injury were also part of the risk. A fall from a horse, a twisted ankle on uneven ground, or a cart accident could turn a routine trip into a serious emergency. Medical care was not readily available on the road. A traveler had to either make it to the next settlement or rely on whatever remedies they carried themselves. For those who fell ill with fever or infection, the journey could end far from home, in a strange place with little comfort. Getting lost was more common than many might imagine. Without accurate maps and with very few road signs, navigation depended on memory, local knowledge, and the ability to recognize landmarks. In unfamiliar territory, a fork in the road or a poorly marked track could lead miles in the wrong direction before the mistake was realized. Dense forests and rolling hills could disorient even experienced travelers. In some cases, wandering off the known road in search of a shortcut led to danger, as these side paths could lead straight into bandit territory or unwelcoming villages. Human conflict posed another serious risk. Roads often crossed the boundaries of different lords' lands, and those territories were not always on friendly terms. A traveler might be stopped at a toll gate and forced to pay an unexpected fee, or questioned by armed men suspicious of outsiders. In times of war or unrest, roads could become battlegrounds or be patrolled by soldiers who were little more than armed looters. Even carrying the wrong kind of goods, or being mistaken for someone else, could lead to arrest or worse. Superstition and fear of the unknown also played a role. In an age when ghost stories, tales of witches, and rumors of haunted places were widely believed, there were stretches of road travelers preferred to avoid entirely after dark. Some routes were said to be cursed, where strange lights appeared in the night, or where travelers vanished without explanation. While such stories may have been exaggerated, they often pointed to real dangers, dangerous bogs, cliffs, or predator-filled woods, that had earned a reputation through repeated misfortune. Every threat was made worse by the isolation of the road. Unlike modern travel, there was no guarantee that help was nearby. A traveler who fell into trouble might wait hours, even days, before another person passed by. This isolation meant that caution was not just wise, it was essential. The most experienced travelers understood that survival depended on awareness, preparation, and sometimes simply on luck. Choosing when to travel, who to travel with, and which roads to take could mean the difference between reaching one's destination and never arriving at all. One of the most reliable ways to reduce the dangers of the medieval road was to avoid traveling alone. In an age where even short journeys could present serious risks, companionship was not just about conversation, it was a form of protection. Groups of travelers, whether large or small, had better chances of deterring attacks, avoiding getting lost, and dealing with emergencies. Bandits, for example, were far less likely to confront a group of 10 armed merchants than a single unarmed pilgrim. Numbers meant strength, and in many cases they also meant resources. Traveling in a group could take several forms. Merchants often formed caravans, especially when moving expensive or bulky goods over long distances. These convoys included wagons, pack animals, and hired guards who were paid specifically to defend the group. Guards might be professional soldiers, local men familiar with the area, or even fellow merchants who took turns keeping watch at night. The sight of a well-organized caravan was often enough to make opportunistic thieves reconsider an attack. For smaller traders who could not afford dedicated protection, Joining a larger merchant train offered the same safety at a fraction of the cost, as they could contribute to the collective guard instead of paying for their own. Pilgrims also understood the importance of numbers. Pilgrimage routes were often long, stretching hundreds of miles, and pilgrims were particularly vulnerable because they carried money for inns and food, but rarely carried serious weapons. To protect themselves, pilgrims would form walking groups, sometimes organized through churches before departure, sometimes formed spontaneously when travelers met on the road. These groups followed unwritten rules. They shared food if someone ran out, helped the sick or injured, and defended each other if trouble arose. Pilgrim groups often carried symbols, such as badges or crosses, that marked their destination, signaling both their religious intent and their solidarity. Traveling with others also provided practical benefits beyond defense. A group could pool knowledge of the road ahead, with members sharing information about the safest routes, the nearest bridges, or the locations of hospitable monasteries. If the group came across a broken cart or an injured animal, they could work together to solve the problem instead of abandoning the journey. In the event of sickness or injury, companions could fetch help, carry the person to shelter, or guard their possessions until recovery. There was also a psychological comfort in numbers. A lone traveler in a dark forest might imagine threats in every rustle of leaves, but with a group, the fear was shared and diminished. The sound of many voices, the glow of multiple campfires, and the sight of armed companions could keep away not only human dangers, but also wild animals. Wolves, for example, were far less likely to approach a camp filled with shouting, torch-bearing people than a single quiet traveler huddled under a tree. Sometimes, larger groups would hire local guides to lead them through especially dangerous stretches of road. These guides knew where ambushes were most likely, which paths became impassable in bad weather, and where a group could stop safely for the night. They also served as negotiators if the travelers encountered toll keepers or local lords, smoothing over disputes before they turned into trouble. The formation of travel alliances could be formal or informal. In some regions, market towns established official departure times for caravans, so that merchants heading to the same destination could leave together with guards provided by the town. In other cases, the alliance might be no more than a few strangers deciding over an inn table to leave at dawn and stick together until the next major stop. While such arrangements could be temporary, they still provided a significant boost to safety during the most dangerous stretches. Of course, traveling in groups was not without its own complications. Disagreements over pace, disputes about shared expenses, and tensions between strangers could make the journey more stressful. A slower member of the group could delay everyone, while a reckless one could put all at risk by insisting on taking a shortcut or challenging an armed toll collector. Yet for most medieval travelers, these inconveniences were minor compared to the dangers of the road. The knowledge that someone else was watching your back, whether a hired guard, a fellow merchant, or a stranger walking beside you, was worth the trade-off. In the medieval world, survival often depended on forming the right alliances at the right time. A single traveler might be brave, well-prepared, and skilled with a weapon, but the road was unpredictable, and fortune could turn quickly. Groups offered something a lone traveler could never truly have: the reassurance that if trouble came, they would not face it alone. For many, that reassurance was the difference between reaching their destination and never being heard from again. In the medieval world, deciding when to travel was often as important as deciding how to travel. Roads were not fixed, reliable things. They changed with the seasons, the weather, and the political climate. A wise traveler did not simply wake up one morning and set out without thought. Every journey required careful consideration of the calendar, the climate, and the human events that might make the road safer or more dangerous. Seasonal changes were the most obvious factor. In spring, after the worst of the winter had passed, roads began to soften and clear, making travel easier. Grass grew along the verges, animals returned to the fields, and streams ran with fresh water. This was a good time for journeys, but spring also brought heavy rains in many regions, which could turn dirt tracks into muddy hazards, slow wagons to a crawl, and even strand travelers in flooded valleys. For merchants, spring was still favorable because markets began to open again after the lean winter months, and customers were eager for goods. Pilgrims, too, often chose spring for the long roads to holy sites, knowing that the warmer weather would make walking more bearable. Summer brought its own advantages and disadvantages. The days were long, giving more daylight hours for travel, which was important for safety, as few wished to be on the road after dark. Dry weather meant roads were firm, streams were easier to cross, and crops along the way provided opportunities for fresh food. But the heat could be punishing, especially for those on foot or wearing heavy clothing. In some regions, water sources dried up, making long stretches without wells dangerous. Heat also wore down animals more quickly, forcing more frequent rest stops. Some travelers avoided summer entirely if they could, preferring cooler times of year, especially for long distances. Autumn was a mixed season for travel. On the one hand, the weather was cooler and roads were often still dry from summer. On the other, it was harvest time, and many villages were busy gathering crops, leaving fewer people available to help strangers or offer lodging. In some places, this was also the time when thieves were most active, hoping to steal from merchants returning from markets before the winter closed in. Autumn storms could arrive suddenly, bringing strong winds and heavy rains that damaged bridges and washed out roads. Winter was, for most travelers, the worst season. Snow and ice made roads treacherous, especially those that crossed mountains or hills. Short days meant fewer hours to travel in daylight, and long nights brought bitter cold. Inns and monasteries could be overcrowded with travelers who had been forced to stop, and many smaller villages closed their doors to outsiders during the harshest months, keeping what little food they had for themselves. Only those who absolutely had to travel, messengers carrying urgent orders, soldiers moving between garrisons, or people fleeing danger, would choose the winter road if they had any choice at all. In some northern regions, winter also meant that certain routes disappeared entirely, buried under snow until spring. Weather was not the only timing concern. Political events could change the safety of a route overnight. A road that was perfectly safe one month might become dangerous the next if two local lords went to war, if a rebel force seized control of a pass, or if new tolls were introduced by a ruler looking to raise funds. Travelers often waited for news from other regions before setting out, listening for word of bandit attacks, unrest, or road closures. Festivals and fairs also influenced timing. For merchants, planning a journey to coincide with a major market could mean the difference between making a profit and wasting weeks on the road for little return. These events drew large crowds, which meant safety in numbers on the way there, but they also attracted thieves looking to blend in with travelers. Pilgrims often timed their trips to arrive for the feast day of a saint, when a shrine would be at its busiest and most spiritually significant. Even the day of the week could matter. Some travelers preferred to set out at the start of the week, giving themselves several days of movement before the Sabbath, when many towns slowed down or closed completely. Others would deliberately avoid the first days of the week, knowing that roads might be crowded with people heading to nearby markets. Experienced travelers often left in the early morning, maximizing daylight hours and reaching the next safe stopping point well before nightfall. Ultimately, timing a journey was about balancing opportunity with risk. The right season could mean steady progress, friendly encounters, and an easier road ahead. The wrong timing could lead to days trapped by weather, hostile encounters, or exhausting detours. In the medieval world, where every mile traveled required effort, and every night spent on the road carried uncertainty, the wisdom to choose the right moment to leave could be as valuable as the money in a traveler's purse or the sword at their side. In the Middle Ages, deciding which route to take was never a matter of simply following the shortest path between 2 points. A traveler had to weigh countless factors, some obvious, others learned only through hard experience, before committing to a road. Unlike today's neat and paved highways, medieval routes were a patchwork of old Roman roads still in use, muddy tracks worn down by cartwheels, and narrow footpaths winding through forest and field. Each had its own advantages and dangers, and the decision of which to take could determine whether a traveler arrived safely, late, or not at all. One of the first considerations was the terrain. Flat, open roads across farmland were generally easier to travel, but they also left a person exposed to anyone watching from a distance. A lone figure with a loaded cart was an easy target on an open plain, with nowhere to hide and no warning before trouble approached. Roads through forests offered more cover and sometimes shorter distances, but they were notorious for harboring bandits who could conceal themselves until the last moment. River crossings were another major concern. Choosing a route with a sturdy bridge could save hours or even days, but such crossings were often guarded by toll keepers, who might charge steep fees or refuse passage entirely in times of unrest. Waterways themselves were sometimes part of the route. In certain areas, it was faster and safer to load goods onto a boat and travel by river or canal, rather than risk the roads at all. But even then, travelers had to be cautious. Pirates operated on inland waters as well as at sea, and shallow areas or sudden floods could strand a boat far from any settlement. Deciding between land and water was often a gamble, and experienced travelers sometimes switched between the two, using the river where it was safe and returning to the road where it was not. The presence of settlements along the way was another key factor. A route with many villages, inns, or monasteries meant more opportunities for rest, resupply, and shelter. It also meant more people to ask for directions if the road became unclear. However, this came with its own risks. Some villages were wary or outright hostile toward strangers, especially if recent events had made them fearful of outsiders. A road with too many settlements could also slow a traveler down if each one demanded tolls, fees, or inspections of goods. Knowledge of political boundaries was equally important. In a world divided among countless lords, abbots, and kings, crossing from one territory into another could change everything. Some rulers maintained well-patrolled roads and welcomed travelers for the sake of trade. Others saw outsiders as potential spies or troublemakers and might detain them without warning. The same route that was safe one year could become dangerous the next if a local war broke out or a noble decided to raise new taxes. Wise travelers often carried letters of introduction or safe conduct passes to present at checkpoints, but these were not always honored. Weather conditions also influenced route choice. Lowland roads could flood in heavy rain, forcing travelers to take longer, higher paths that were less prone to washouts. In winter, shaded forest roads might stay icy long after open roads had cleared, making them treacherous for carts and horses. In mountainous regions, passes could become impassable for months due to snow, and travelers had to decide whether to wait out the season or attempt a longer, safer detour. Information about routes often came secondhand, through word of mouth. A traveler might hear in an inn that a certain bridge had collapsed, that a village on one route was plagued by illness, or that a dangerous gang had been spotted near a crossroads. Such reports were valuable but not always reliable. Some were exaggerated to scare strangers away from certain routes, leaving them more business in their own towns. Others were already out of date by the time they reached the ears of someone planning a journey. The best travelers learned to weigh the credibility of their sources, often asking multiple people before deciding. There were also less tangible considerations. Certain roads carried reputations for being cursed or haunted, and while not everyone believed these tales, enough people did that such routes might be eerily empty, which in itself could be a danger. Other roads were avoided not because of superstition, but because they passed through areas with poor food, no clean water, or few safe places to sleep. A bad night on such a road could weaken a traveler enough to make them easy prey for disease or attack. Sometimes, the decision came down to speed versus safety. A shorter route might cut a day or two off the journey, but if it passed through an area known for robberies, a cautious traveler might opt for the longer way. Merchants with perishable goods or messengers carrying urgent letters often had no choice but to take the faster road, accepting the greater risk. Pilgrims or craftsmen without time pressure were more likely to choose a safer, slower route with plenty of stops. In the end, choosing the right route in medieval times was less about finding the perfect road and more about managing risk. No route was completely free from danger, but with careful planning, a traveler could tilt the odds in their favor. Knowledge, preparation, and sometimes a willingness to turn back if the way ahead seemed wrong, could mean the difference between arriving at one's destination and disappearing into the long list of those who never made it. For any medieval traveler, one of the most important and constant concerns was the safety of their possessions. On dangerous roads, valuables could disappear in an instant, taken by thieves, lost in an accident, or even confiscated by corrupt officials. This reality shaped how people planned their journeys, what they chose to carry, and how they kept those items secure. Traveling with wealth in the Middle Ages was as much about strategy as it was about courage. The first step in protecting valuables often began before the journey even started. Most travelers avoided carrying more than they absolutely needed. Large sums of money were rarely transported in the form of coins if it could be avoided, because coins were heavy, bulky, and easy for thieves to recognize. Merchants and wealthy pilgrims often used letters of credit or bills of exchange instead. These were written documents issued by a trusted moneylender or trading house that allowed the traveler to collect their funds upon arrival in another town. This system meant that if they were robbed, the thieves would gain little more than a worthless piece of parchment. For those who did carry coins, secrecy was key. Money might be divided into several small pouches, hidden in different places. One around the neck under clothing, another sewn into a tunic lining, and perhaps a few coins kept in a more obvious belt pouch to satisfy casual tollkeepers or market sellers without revealing the full amount. This not only protected against theft, but also prevented the awkward and dangerous display of a large sum in public. Merchants transporting goods faced a different set of challenges. Their cargo was often too large to hide, so protection came from vigilance and deterrence. Traveling with guards was common for valuable shipments, but merchants also used deception. Expensive fabrics might be wrapped inside bundles of cheaper cloth, jewels could be hidden in barrels of grain, and rare spices might be stored in unmarked sacks alongside more common goods to make them harder to identify. In some cases, merchants even hired decoy wagons to travel alongside the real shipment, drawing attention away from the most valuable load. Small valuable items, such as rings, religious relics, or important letters, were often carried on the person rather than left in a cart or pack. Wealthy travelers might wear jewelry beneath their clothing, out of sight, or hide relics in specially made belt pouches that looked plain on the outside but contained secret compartments. A trusted servant or companion might also be given part of the valuables to carry separately, ensuring that even if one person were robbed, not everything would be lost. Nighttime presented its own dangers, and travelers took care when storing goods while sleeping. In crowded inns, valuables might be kept in a locked chest placed close to the bed, or even used as a pillow for extra security. On the road, when camping outdoors, possessions were often arranged in a circle with sleeping companions surrounding them, making it harder for thieves to approach unnoticed. Some groups set watches during the night, taking turns to guard both people and property. Protecting valuables also meant protecting them from the elements. Rain could damage parchment documents, ruin food supplies, and rot fabrics. Leather pouches, waxed cloth wraps, and wooden chests lined with pitch were used to keep items dry. In winter, freezing temperatures could crack delicate items or make certain goods, like wine, spoil, so travelers insulated them with straw or wool. In summer, heat and dust were the enemy, and goods had to be covered and shaded to prevent spoilage or fading. Bribery, though less honorable, was also a reality. In some areas, it was easier to protect valuables by quietly paying off a local gang or an armed tollkeeper rather than risking a confrontation. This was particularly true in regions where local authorities were weak and bandits operated openly. By establishing a kind of safe passage fee, a traveler could sometimes ensure that they would be left alone for the rest of their journey through a dangerous area. There was also the ever-present danger of loss through misplacement or carelessness. Roads were long, fatigue was constant, and travelers had to remain aware of their belongings at all times. A carelessly dropped pouch in a muddy track could vanish before its owner realized it was missing. For this reason, experienced travelers developed routines, checking the contents of their packs each morning before departure, counting coins at every stop, and securing straps and fastenings multiple times a day. Religious travelers sometimes sought divine protection for their valuables, carrying blessed charms or placing their trust in the sanctity of their mission. While such faith could not physically stop a thief, the presence of holy symbols might persuade some to leave pilgrims alone, fearing spiritual consequences. Similarly, merchants aligned with powerful guilds often displayed symbols of their affiliation, which could discourage theft by signaling that the loss of goods would provoke organized retaliation. In the medieval world, keeping one's valuables safe was not about a single trick or tool. It was a constant process of caution, preparation, and awareness. A traveler who took no steps to secure their possessions was unlikely to reach their destination with them intact. Whether through clever hiding places, armed guards, careful packing, or strategic negotiation, survival on the road often depended not only on protecting one's own life, but on protecting the means to live it once the journey was over. In the medieval world, the search for shelter at the end of a long day's journey was not as simple as walking into a hotel and booking a room. The roads were unpredictable, settlements were scattered unevenly across the landscape, and the safety of a traveler at night often depended on choosing the right place to rest. For many, finding shelter was as important as navigating the road itself, because a bad choice could result in being robbed, attacked, or left exposed to the elements. Travelers planned their days with resting places in mind, but maps as we know them today were rare, and most routes were learned by word of mouth. Experienced travelers often knew which villages had welcoming inns, which monasteries were generous with hospitality, and which towns were best avoided entirely. This knowledge was not written down, but passed through stories shared at marketplaces, fairs, or by fellow travelers met along the road. A first-time traveler might rely heavily on such advice, hoping it was accurate, because stopping in the wrong place could be costly in more ways than one. In towns and larger villages, inns were the most common form of lodging for travelers. These varied widely in quality. A well-kept inn might have clean straw bedding, a fireplace, and warm food, while a poorly run one might offer nothing more than a cold corner of a crowded room. Travelers often slept several to a bed, sharing space with strangers and their belongings. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even then, valuables were never left unguarded. Some inns doubled as taverns, attracting locals as well as travelers, which could be lively but also riskier, as drunken brawls or thefts were not uncommon. Monasteries and other religious houses were a preferred option for many, especially pilgrims. The church had a long tradition of offering hospitality to travelers, and monks or nuns might provide food, a bed, and a safe place to rest, asking little or nothing in return. However, the generosity of monasteries varied depending on their wealth and resources. Some were known for their open doors, while others were more selective, offering shelter only to those with letters of introduction or who appeared truly in need. Religious houses also tended to have strict rules. Travelers were expected to follow the house's schedule, which could mean waking before dawn for prayers or eating simple meals without complaint. In smaller settlements without inns or monasteries, travelers might seek lodging in the homes of locals. This was often arranged through introductions. Someone from one village might write to a contact in another, asking them to host the traveler for a night. Without such connections, a stranger knocking on doors might be met with suspicion, particularly in regions that had suffered recent raids or thefts. In some places, villagers were required by local law to provide food and shelter to travelers for a night, but such obligations were not always welcomed and could lead to tense hospitality. When no formal lodging was available, travelers had to rely on the natural environment for shelter. Woods could provide cover from the wind but also posed dangers, from wild animals to hidden thieves. Sleeping near a water source was convenient but risky, as flooding could occur suddenly and predators were often drawn to rivers and streams. Some travelers carried small tents or lean-to shelters, while others simply wrapped themselves in cloaks and blankets, sleeping by a campfire if fuel was available. Keeping a fire burning not only provided warmth but also acted as a deterrent to both animals and people who might approach during the night. Safety was the constant concern in choosing where to rest. A lone traveler might seek out other travelers to camp with, forming a temporary group for the night. Numbers meant protection, and it was common for merchants, pilgrims, and messengers to band together at day's end for mutual safety, even if they went their separate ways in the morning. Travelers on horseback sometimes preferred to sleep near stables or barns, where they could keep an eye on their animals and equipment. In some cases, they would even sleep inside the stable itself, trading comfort for security. Roadside chapels and shrines could also provide limited shelter. While not intended as lodging, their stone walls offered some protection from the wind and rain, and travelers in desperate situations sometimes took refuge inside or under their eaves. Such shelter was far from comfortable, but it could mean the difference between surviving the night and succumbing to the elements. The choice of where to stay also depended on the political and social conditions of the area. In peaceful regions with strong local governance, travelers could be more confident in stopping at inns or in villages. In places where law enforcement was weak or absent, a poorly chosen resting place could lead to trouble. Bandits sometimes worked with unscrupulous innkeepers, who would alert them to wealthy guests. In such areas, experienced travelers often preferred to push on longer into the night to reach a safer location, even if it meant exhausting themselves. Travelers also had to consider cost. Inns charged for beds, meals, and stable space, and prices could be high along busy trade routes or near popular pilgrimage destinations. Monasteries were generally free, but not always convenient to the traveler's route. Staying with locals could range from free hospitality to a negotiated payment in food, goods, or labor. Those traveling on a tight budget often alternated between paid lodging and camping, stretching their money as far as possible. Ultimately, finding safe shelter in the medieval world required constant judgment and adaptability. A traveler might have a planned stopping point in mind, but be forced to change it due to weather, illness, or local unrest. Those who survived the road learned to make quick decisions based on the signs around them, the look of a settlement, the demeanor of its people, the number of travelers already staying there, and the feel of the place as night approached. In a time when the line between safety and danger could shift in the space of a mile, knowing where and when to rest was not just a matter of comfort, it was an essential part of survival. For a medieval traveler, the threat of bandits was never far from mind. Roads passed through vast stretches of wilderness, lonely fields, and thick forests where the law barely reached. Even near settlements, danger could lurk just out of sight. Bandits came in many forms. Desperate peasants turned to robbery during times of famine, discharged soldiers seeking loot after a war, organized gangs that controlled entire routes, and even corrupt officials who used their authority as a mask for extortion. Surviving these encounters required a combination of preparation, awareness, and sometimes quick thinking. The first and most effective strategy was to avoid danger altogether. Travelers learned to recognize warning signs, fresh hoofprints leading off the road into cover, unusually quiet stretches of forest where birds had gone silent, or rumors shared at inns about recent attacks in certain areas. Changing one's route, even if it meant days of extra travel, was often better than risking a known danger. Traveling in groups was another common precaution. Merchants, pilgrims, and messengers would often join together temporarily for safety, knowing that bandits were less likely to attack a large, well-armed group than a lone rider or a small party. When avoidance was not possible, travelers relied on visibility and readiness. Roads with open views allowed them to spot trouble in time to turn back or prepare. In dense woods, where ambushes were easier to set up, riders kept weapons within easy reach, and carts were arranged so that valuables could be quickly moved or hidden if needed. Even non-combatants sometimes carried small arms, a dagger tucked into a belt, or a walking staff that could double as a weapon. Not all travelers were trained fighters, but even the appearance of readiness could be enough to make an attacker hesitate. Disguise was another tool. Wealthy travelers sometimes dressed in plain clothes, concealing fine garments beneath rough cloaks to avoid attracting attention. Expensive horses or wagons could be swapped for more ordinary ones before entering dangerous areas. Some merchants went further, traveling under the guise of pilgrims or simple farmers, hiding their wares in unremarkable bundles. While this could protect them from casual thieves, it was less effective against experienced gangs who knew how to spot concealed wealth. Bribery and negotiation were sometimes the safest path. Certain regions were controlled by outlaw bands so firmly that they acted almost like unofficial toll collectors. Travelers who paid these fees were often allowed to pass without harm. While morally questionable, such arrangements were a practical reality. Refusing to pay could provoke violence, whereas handing over a small portion of goods or money might save the rest. In some cases, repeat travelers formed an understanding with local gangs, paying them regularly in exchange for protection against other robbers. If an encounter turned violent, survival depended on the circumstances. Lone travelers had few options beyond fleeing if possible, often abandoning non-essential items to distract pursuers. Groups could sometimes fight back, especially if they had armed guards, but even then, a battle on the road was risky. Injuries could be as dangerous as the attackers themselves, leaving survivors unable to continue their journey. For that reason, many travelers prioritized escape over confrontation, seeking safety in nearby villages, monasteries, or even fortified bridges. Bandits were not the only threat on medieval roads. Wild animals, though less common, could be dangerous, especially in remote areas. Wolves might attack livestock or lone travelers, particularly in winter when food was scarce. Bears, boars, and large packs of stray dogs posed risks as well. Experienced travelers knew how to make noise while moving through dense woods to avoid surprising such animals, and they kept fires burning at night to deter predators. Weather could also become an enemy as dangerous as any human threat. Sudden storms could turn a passable road into a deadly trap, washing away bridges or flooding lowland paths. Heavy snow could leave travelers stranded for days, forcing them to ration supplies carefully. In some regions, intense heat posed its own dangers, especially for those carrying livestock or perishable goods. Navigating the elements required preparation, carrying extra food and water, knowing where to find shelter quickly, and understanding the local climate's patterns. Another danger came from human authorities themselves. Not all threats wore the face of an outlaw. Some toll-keepers overcharged travelers or invented fees on the spot, threatening confiscation or imprisonment for those who refused to pay. Soldiers or guards could be equally unpredictable, especially in regions plagued by political unrest. Travelers carrying goods might be accused of smuggling or treason, sometimes as a pretext for taking their belongings. In these cases, papers proving one's right to travel, letters from influential patrons, or connections to powerful guilds could make the difference between being allowed through and losing everything. Disease and illness were quieter but ever-present dangers. Poor sanitation in inns, unclean water sources along the road, and the exhaustion of long travel all weakened a person's defenses. Bandits might be feared in the moment, but sickness could end a journey just as surely. For that reason, careful travelers avoided drinking from stagnant water, carried simple remedies like dried herbs, and rested whenever illness threatened to worsen. In the end, dealing with bandits and other threats on medieval roads required more than bravery. It demanded a constant awareness of one's surroundings, the humility to avoid fights when possible, and the adaptability to change plans at a moment's notice. A wise traveler accepted that danger was part of the road and prepared accordingly, moving carefully, watching the horizon, trusting only those who had earned it, and remembering that survival often depended not on strength alone, but on knowing when to fight, when to bargain, and when to simply keep walking. In the medieval world, no matter how skilled, wealthy, or experienced a traveler might be, journeying alone was rarely the safest choice. Companionship was not only a source of comfort, it was a practical necessity for survival. Roads were unpredictable, dangers could appear without warning, and the simplest problems could become deadly when faced alone. A twisted ankle on a remote path, a broken wagon wheel far from any village, or the sudden onset of fever could leave a lone traveler stranded. In a group, however, there were more hands to help, more eyes to watch for threats, and more voices to lift morale when the days were long and the road felt endless. Companions came in many forms. Some were friends or family members who set out together with a shared purpose. Others were strangers met along the way, people whose paths happened to align for a stretch of the journey. These temporary alliances might last only a few days, until the road split, or they could turn into lifelong friendships forged through shared hardship. In many cases, fellow travelers did not even need to share the same destination to see the benefit in walking together. Safety in numbers was reason enough. For merchants, companionship often took the form of a caravan. Several traders traveling together could pool their resources to hire armed guards, making the road far less inviting to bandits. They could also share pack animals, tools, and knowledge about routes, markets, and local customs. If one wagon broke down, others could help repair it or carry part of the load until it could be fixed. For pilgrims, traveling together offered both protection and spiritual fellowship. Large groups of pilgrims moving toward a shrine were less likely to be attacked, and along the way they could share prayers, songs, and meals, turning the road itself into part of the pilgrimage experience. Companionship was not only about defense. On dangerous roads, the simple act of having someone to talk to could help pass the long, monotonous hours between settlements. Conversation eased the strain of walking or riding for miles on end. Companions could take turns telling stories, singing, or sharing news from their respective hometowns. For many travelers, especially those who spent weeks or months on the road, these moments of human connection were as valuable as food or shelter. There was also a practical advantage in traveling with people who had different skills. A soldier or guard could protect the group in an ambush. A skilled cook could turn meager supplies into nourishing meals. Someone with knowledge of herbal medicine could treat wounds or illness when far from any physician. A person familiar with the local language or dialect could negotiate with villagers, haggle with merchants, or ask for directions. These varied abilities increased the group's chances of not just surviving the journey, but completing it in better condition. Even the act of making camp was safer and easier with others. One person could gather firewood while another set up shelter. Someone could prepare food while another watched the road for approaching strangers. In the middle of the night, companions could take turns keeping watch, allowing the others to sleep without fear of surprise attacks from thieves or wild animals. In poor weather, they could share blankets, cloaks, or space under a larger shelter, reducing the risk of exposure. However, companionship was not without its challenges. Traveling with others meant adjusting to their pace, preferences, and decisions. Disagreements over routes, spending, or how to handle dangers could create tension. A group's safety depended on trust, and a dishonest companion could cause as much harm as any bandit. There were also cases of travelers who joined a group only to betray it later, leading their so-called friends into ambushes or stealing from them during the night. For this reason, many medieval travelers were cautious about who they accepted into their company, often observing strangers for a day or two before agreeing to travel together. Trust, once earned, could mean the difference between life and death. A loyal companion might risk their own safety to defend a friend in a fight, help carry them when injured, or share their last meal during famine. Such bonds were not easily forgotten, and stories of faithful travel companions became part of the oral traditions of many regions. Minstrels and storytellers would sing of friends who crossed mountains, fought off robbers, or braved storms together, inspiring others to value fellowship on the road. Animals, too, could be considered companions. A reliable horse, mule, or dog was more than just a tool for transport or protection. They were partners in survival. A horse could carry an injured traveler to safety. A dog's keen senses might detect danger before any human heard it. Mules, with their endurance, could bear heavy loads over long distances, sparing their human companions from exhausting labor. Many travelers formed deep attachments to these animals, treating them with care and gratitude, knowing their own fate was often tied to the health and strength of their beasts. The value of companionship extended beyond the journey itself. Arriving in a new town or city with others often meant being welcomed more warmly than if arriving alone. Groups could present themselves as reputable traders, organized pilgrims, or official messengers, making them less likely to be harassed by suspicious guards or dishonest merchants. Companions could also vouch for each other's character, a crucial advantage in unfamiliar places where one's word meant little without witnesses. In the dangerous and uncertain world of medieval travel, companionship was more than a comfort, it was a survival strategy. The road was long and its dangers many, but with trustworthy allies, travelers could face them with greater confidence. A lone traveler might rely solely on caution and luck, but those who walked together could rely on shared strength, shared watchfulness, and shared humanity. In a time when even a short journey could test a person's endurance, the bonds formed along the way often proved to be the most valuable reward of all. Reaching the end of a medieval journey was rarely a moment of loud celebration. More often, it was a slow, almost quiet relief that settled in as the traveler saw the familiar outline of a town, the walls of a city, or the welcoming gate of a home. The road had been long, the dangers many, and the outcome never guaranteed. Even the most experienced travelers never truly assumed they would reach their destination without trouble. Every mile completed without injury, loss, or disaster was a small victory, and arriving in one piece was the greatest reward of all. For some, the end of the journey meant returning to their own village or city after weeks or months away. They would be greeted by family, friends, or fellow merchants, and the first order of business was often to share stories. These were not only for entertainment, they carried practical knowledge. Tales of which routes were safe, which inns were dishonest, where floods had washed away bridges, or where bandits had recently been spotted could prepare the next traveler before they set foot on the road. In this way, each completed journey became part of a larger network of shared experience, slowly building the collective wisdom of a region. For others, especially merchants, pilgrims, or messengers, the journey's end was not truly an end, but a brief pause before the next road began. A merchant might unpack goods, sell wares, and immediately begin planning the return trip. Pilgrims, having reached their sacred destination, might still have weeks of travel ahead before returning home. Messengers often had to deliver news or documents quickly and then retrace their steps, repeating the same hazards in reverse. The end of one leg of travel was simply the beginning of another. The physical toll of the road was always present, even at journey's end. Feet blistered from walking in rough boots, backs sore from riding for hours each day, and muscles aching from lifting, pulling, and pushing loads reminded travelers of the effort it had taken to get there. Many took several days to rest before resuming normal work, especially if illness or injury had been endured along the way. In some cases, the journey permanently changed a traveler's health, old injuries lingering as constant reminders of the risks faced. There were also the mental lessons learned, which were often just as important as the physical survival. A traveler who had been caught in a sudden storm and nearly lost the road learned to prepare better for weather. One who had trusted the wrong person and been cheated out of supplies learned to be cautious in making agreements. A merchant who had overestimated the safety of a particular route might alter their trade network entirely. These were not lessons easily forgotten. They were hard-earned knowledge that shaped every future journey. The end of a journey also often changed the way a traveler thought about danger. Those who had narrowly escaped a bandit attack might take greater care in avoiding certain stretches of road. Those who had been helped by strangers might find themselves more willing to offer help in return, understanding the value of compassion when far from home. For many, the hardships of the road deepened their respect for others who made such journeys, whether they were traders, pilgrims, or wandering laborers. Some travelers returned home with more than just stories and experience. They brought back physical reminders of their trip. These could be goods purchased or traded for along the way, religious tokens from a pilgrimage site, letters from distant acquaintances, or even small trinkets that held personal meaning. Such items often became treasured possessions, not necessarily for their material value, but for the memories they carried. A carved wooden spoon from a monastery kitchen, or a simple coin from a far-off city could hold more emotional weight than gold, because it spoke of survival, movement, and the passing of miles. The final stage of any journey was reflection. In the quiet moments after arriving, travelers often thought back over the choices they had made, the dangers they had faced, and the people they had met. They remembered the nights when a companion's presence had kept fear at bay, the relief of finding shelter before a storm broke, the tense moment when the sound of hooves in the dark had made them reach for a weapon. They remembered the villages that welcomed them warmly, and the ones that closed their gates in suspicion. All of these memories blended into a complex picture of the road, a place of hardship, unpredictability, and risk, but also of human resilience, resourcefulness, and connection. For those who survived many journeys, these reflections often turned into advice for the younger or less experienced. Older travelers might caution the next generation about certain routes, teach them how to pack efficiently, or show them how to judge the character of a stranger by their manner of speech and behavior. The wisdom of one traveler passed on to another was one of the few defenses that could be carried from road to road without adding weight to a pack. And so, while the end of a journey marked the completion of one chapter, it also reinforced the unchanging truth of medieval travel. Survival depended on preparation, adaptability, and the bonds formed along the way. Roads were never truly safe, but they were also never entirely empty of kindness. Even in the harshest conditions, there were moments of generosity, cooperation, and shared humanity that gave travelers the strength to take the next step, to face the next mile, and to eventually stand at the gates of their destination, tired, worn, and perhaps forever changed, but alive. When we look back at medieval travel today, it's easy to see it as something far removed from modern life. A world of dirt tracks, horse hooves, heavy carts, and people wrapped in cloaks trudging along uneven roads. But the truth is that the experiences of those travelers left a legacy that still shapes how we think about journeys, safety, and connection. The way medieval people adapted to dangerous roads, organized themselves for protection, and shared information with others laid the foundation for many of the systems we take for granted now. Their challenges forced them to innovate in small but lasting ways, and the lessons they learned became part of the unspoken rules of travel that lasted for centuries. One of the most enduring legacies was the development of safer routes and better infrastructure. In the medieval period, repeated use of certain paths slowly transformed them into recognized roads, and over time, local rulers and communities began maintaining them, not out of charity, but because safe roads meant more trade, more tax revenue, and more prosperity. Bridges that had once been little more than planks across streams became sturdy stone constructions, able to withstand floods and heavy traffic. Inns began appearing at regular distances along busy roads, catering to the steady flow of merchants, pilgrims, and messengers who needed food and rest. In this way, the survival strategies of individual travelers, seeking safe paths, avoiding dangerous areas, relying on certain waypoints, eventually influenced entire networks of trade and movement. Another legacy came in the form of communication and information sharing. Medieval travelers often depended on word-of-mouth warnings about where danger lay ahead, but these informal systems evolved over time into more organized networks. Merchants' guilds, religious orders, and even royal courts began keeping records of safe routes, reliable inns, and dangerous regions. In many places, messages were carried by trusted couriers who became the lifeline between distant communities. The road was never entirely safe, but knowing which stretches were least risky could mean the difference between life and death. This practice of exchanging travel intelligence is something that still exists today in the form of travel advisories, guidebooks, and modern navigation tools. The bonds formed between travelers were also part of this legacy. In the medieval period, it was common for people who met on the road to form temporary alliances for safety. Over time, these loose associations gave rise to more permanent arrangements, caravan routes, pilgrimage companies, and merchant convoys that operated on set schedules. Even now, the idea that traveling with others increases safety is deeply ingrained in our thinking, whether it's hikers going into the wilderness in pairs or modern truck drivers traveling in convoys. The medieval understanding of safety in numbers became a universal travel truth. The dangers of the road also left cultural imprints. Tales of brave travelers, cunning merchants, and loyal companions became part of folklore and literature. These stories weren't just for entertainment, they were warnings, lessons, and sources of inspiration. They reminded people that the road tested not only a person's strength, but also their patience, resourcefulness, and ability to trust the right people at the right time. In some regions, local songs and ballads still carry echoes of these stories, passed down for generations. Even in modern films and books, we see variations of the same themes: the dangerous journey, the loyal friend, the betrayal on the road, the relief of safe arrival. Religious travel, especially pilgrimages, left an even deeper mark. Medieval pilgrims had to prepare carefully, choosing routes that were both spiritually significant and physically survivable. The networks of inns, hospices, and monasteries that grew up along major pilgrimage routes were a direct response to the needs of these travelers. Many of those buildings are still standing today, some still serving as places of rest for travelers centuries later. The very idea of organized hospitality, welcoming strangers and giving them shelter, was reinforced by centuries of responding to the needs of people on the move. There is also a legal legacy. Because so many disputes and dangers arose on the road, bandit attacks, thefts, unfair tolls, local and regional authorities began to create travel laws to regulate behavior and protect commerce. Some rulers even issued safe conduct passes, guaranteeing that a traveler under their protection could move without harassment through certain territories. While enforcement varied, the concept that travel should be protected by law was an important step toward the rights and agreements that govern movement between regions today. The memory of danger itself became part of the legacy. Communities along historically dangerous routes often developed a cautious, watchful culture, aware that strangers could be either allies or threats. At the same time, villages and towns that became known as safe havens took pride in their reputation, attracting more travelers and trade. The road shaped not just individual lives, but the identities of entire communities, linking them to larger networks of movement. Finally, there is the legacy of resilience. Medieval travelers knew that the road could never be made entirely safe. They accepted that storms, illness, thieves, and accidents were part of the risk. Yet they still set out, whether for profit, faith, duty, or personal ambition. The quiet determination of those travelers, ordinary people who faced uncertainty with preparation and courage, is something that still resonates. It is a reminder that travel has always required trust, adaptability, and a willingness to face the unknown. Even now, when we drive on paved highways, cross sturdy bridges, and book a room with a few taps on a phone, the echoes of medieval travel are still there. The safety we enjoy was built, in part, by generations of travelers who learned the hard way how to survive on dangerous roads, and who left behind knowledge, customs, and structures that continue to guide us. Their journeys, though long past, are woven into the history of movement itself, a history that still shapes every road we take today. Medieval travel was not an isolated act of people moving from one place to another. It was part of a much larger chain of events that connected villages, towns, kingdoms, and even entire continents in ways that would permanently shape the course of history. Every person who stepped onto a dangerous road in the Middle Ages, whether they were a merchant, a pilgrim, a messenger, a soldier, or even a wandering laborer, carried something with them that had the potential to change the place they left and the place they arrived in. Sometimes it was a new idea. Sometimes it was a valuable product. Sometimes it was simply a story. But over time, the movement of people across dangerous roads became one of the main forces knitting the medieval world together. Trade was one of the most obvious ways travel influenced the world beyond the roads. A merchant traveling from one city to another didn't just sell goods. They introduced foreign items to local markets and exposed communities to materials and technologies they had never seen before. Spices from the East could appear in a European port town because a chain of travelers, traders, and intermediaries had carried them step by step across mountains, deserts, and seas. Cloth patterns, metalwork designs, and agricultural techniques could spread from one region to another simply because a traveling artisan had learned something in one place and put it into practice somewhere else. Even small everyday goods, simple pots, knives, or woven baskets, could carry design elements from far-off lands, proof that ideas traveled alongside objects. The exchange of ideas and culture was just as important as the movement of physical goods. Traveling scholars, monks, and religious pilgrims brought with them not just their personal beliefs, but also books, manuscripts, and oral knowledge. Monasteries became centers for storing and copying texts precisely because travelers kept bringing in new ones. Without the constant arrival of people from different regions, much of Europe's classical heritage might have been lost. Travelers spread not only religious practices, but also medical knowledge, astronomical observations, and even culinary recipes. A single traveler's tale of how another culture treated illness or cultivated crops could inspire entire communities to adopt new practices. Political influence also moved along these dangerous roads. Messengers carried instructions from kings to distant provinces. Diplomats and envoys traveled to form alliances or negotiate peace treaties. These journeys were risky, but without them, kingdoms could easily fragment and lose control over far-flung territories. Some rulers even relied on trusted travelers to act as informal spies, reporting on the state of roads, the condition of towns, and the mood of the people. Political news often moved at the speed of the traveler carrying it, and this meant that entire wars, rebellions, or uprisings could be delayed or accelerated depending on how quickly someone could make it from one place to another without being stopped by weather, illness, or violence. Travel also shaped languages and communication. When traders, pilgrims, and soldiers from different linguistic backgrounds met along the road, they had to find ways to understand each other. Over time, this led to the creation of trade languages and the borrowing of words between cultures. In markets and ports, people might speak in a patchwork of dialects, picking and choosing the most useful terms from each language they encountered. This exchange didn't just make travel easier, it permanently altered the vocabulary of entire regions. Modern languages still carry hundreds of words that entered them centuries ago because someone, somewhere, spoke them to a traveler who passed them along. The spread of religion was another world-shaping outcome of medieval travel. Pilgrims moving to and from sacred sites didn't just strengthen their own faith, they often inspired others to join them. Religious relics, icons, and symbols moved along with these travelers, helping to unify belief systems across vast areas. Missionaries relied entirely on the ability to travel, and although the roads were dangerous, the determination to spread faith often outweighed the risks. As these religious travelers moved, they created networks of hospices, monasteries, and way stations that not only supported pilgrims but also became centers of local life and learning. Even conflict was shaped by travel. The ability to move troops quickly along a road could determine the outcome of a battle or a siege. Roads that were safer for merchants were also safer for armies, and medieval rulers often improved infrastructure specifically to make military travel easier. This meant that roads built or maintained for trade could just as easily serve as invasion routes. For ordinary people, this was a double-edged sword. Better roads might bring prosperity through trade, but they could also bring war to their doorsteps faster than before. The influence of medieval travel also extended to the movement of diseases. As grim as it is, one of the most dramatic examples was the spread of the Black Death in the 14th century. The very networks of trade and pilgrimage that had helped connect the medieval world also carried the plague from port cities inland, moving along the same roads that merchants and pilgrims used daily. This was a tragic reminder that the movement of people could bring both growth and destruction, prosperity and loss. Social change often followed the patterns of travel. People who traveled far from home sometimes chose not to return, settling in new towns and bringing with them skills, customs, and ways of thinking from their birthplace. This movement slowly blended cultures together, making regions more diverse. Marriages between locals and travelers were common in towns along busy routes, and these connections created family ties that spanned large distances. Over generations, entire communities could change their identity because of the steady influence of travelers passing through. Even art and storytelling were shaped by travel. Minstrels, poets, and artists often relied on travelers' tales for inspiration. A story heard in a roadside inn could find its way into a song performed hundreds of miles away. Artists painted scenes of far-off lands they had never seen, relying on descriptions brought back by travelers. Over time, the image of the road itself became a symbol, sometimes of danger, sometimes of opportunity, but always of change. In the end, medieval travel shaped the world far beyond the roads themselves. It influenced trade, politics, language, religion, art, and the very structure of societies. Every person who braved those dangerous paths contributed, in some small way, to the slow weaving together of a world that had once been fragmented and isolated. The risks were high, the hardships real, but without the constant movement of people across those uncertain miles, the medieval world would have been a far smaller, poorer, and less connected place. For every medieval traveler who set out along a dangerous road, there was always a before and an after. The person who left their home was never exactly the same person who returned, and for those who never came back, their absence left a mark on their family and community that was often felt for years. The personal legacy of travel in the Middle Ages wasn't just about what someone accomplished during their journey. It was about how the road shaped their character, their decisions, and the way others saw them long after the journey ended. Travel in those days was not a casual decision. For most people, leaving home meant stepping into a world of uncertainty. The simple act of crossing beyond the boundaries of familiar fields and streets was, in itself, a leap into the unknown. At first, many travelers carried a kind of cautious optimism, imagining that with good luck and steady effort, they would make it through without trouble. But the road had a way of teaching lessons quickly. Those who survived learned to think differently, not just about danger, but about people, opportunities, and even themselves. One of the most immediate personal changes was the development of practical skill. A traveler might leave home with little experience in navigation, negotiation, or survival, but within weeks they could find themselves reading the land for signs of weather, learning to gauge the trustworthiness of a stranger, or figuring out how to stretch limited supplies over many days. For merchants, these skills became part of their trade advantage. For pilgrims, they were tools to help them complete their religious mission. The ability to adapt quickly was often the deciding factor between returning home safely and becoming another story told about someone lost to the road. Physical toughness was another legacy. Long days of walking, riding, or hauling goods reshaped the body, often leaving scars, calluses, and muscles built through necessity rather than choice. Illness was common, and surviving it sometimes left a traveler more resistant to future sickness, though just as often it left them weakened. The body recorded the memory of the road in ways that were visible and invisible: limps from poorly healed injuries, sun-darkened skin from days without shelter, or the faint traces of exhaustion that never entirely went away. Mentally, the road could harden a traveler or soften them, depending on the experiences they faced. Some became more guarded, trusting fewer people after seeing betrayal or cruelty along the way. Others became more open, having been helped by strangers and realizing that kindness could appear in the most unexpected places. This shift in perspective was perhaps the most lasting change, because it influenced how travelers behaved once they were back in their communities. A person who had been betrayed might become a local voice for caution, while one who had been shown mercy might take pride in offering hospitality to future travelers. There was also the matter of reputation. A successful journey often elevated a person's standing. A merchant who returned with exotic goods, a pilgrim who reached a distant holy site, or a messenger who carried vital news through hostile territory could gain respect, trust, and sometimes even influence. Their stories became part of their identity, retold in markets, inns, and family gatherings. In some cases, this reputation could lead to new opportunities, better trade deals, invitations to join influential guilds, or roles as guides for less experienced travelers. On the other hand, a failed journey, especially one marked by avoidable mistakes, could damage a reputation, making others hesitant to trust them with important tasks. Travel could also alter personal ambitions. Some returned home satisfied, eager to settle back into familiar routines, never wishing to risk the road again. Others found themselves restless, unable to ignore the pull of new horizons. They had seen different landscapes, heard new languages, tasted unfamiliar food, and felt the thrill of movement. For them, the road was not just a path between two places, it was a way of life. This sometimes created tension in families, especially if repeated travel meant long absences from home or the risk of never returning. In many cases, the personal legacy of a traveler included the connections they made beyond their home region. Friendships formed on the road could last for years, even if the people involved never met again in person. Letters could be exchanged between distant towns, trade partnerships maintained across borders, and news passed along through trusted networks. A single journey might turn a person from a local figure into someone with ties across an entire region, widening their perspective and influence. Travel also left behind, knowledge that was rarely written down but was invaluable. A traveler might know which streams were safe to drink from, which inns overcharged, which mountain passes could be crossed in winter, and which local lords were known for fairness or cruelty. This kind of information often stayed within families or close circles, passed from one generation to the next. In this way, even those who never traveled themselves benefited from the hard-earned lessons of those who had. On a deeper level, the personal legacy of travel was about identity. To survive the road was to prove something, not only to others but to oneself. It showed that a person could endure hardship, make decisions under pressure, and adapt to unpredictable circumstances. This self-knowledge often stayed with travelers for life, shaping how they approached challenges in every other area. They knew from experience that plans could be derailed without warning, and that survival often depended less on strength than on judgment, patience, and timing. Finally, there was the quiet but powerful influence of memory. Even decades later, an older traveler might sit by a fire and recall the sound of distant bells across a foggy valley, the smell of pine in a mountain pass, the sight of a torch-lit caravan arriving after dark. They might remember the tension in their chest when hoofbeats approached from behind, or the deep relief of hearing a friendly voice in a strange place. These memories became part of who they were, markers of where they had been and proof of what they had endured. The personal legacy of medieval travel was not measured only in miles crossed or destinations reached. It was carried in the body, mind, and reputation of the traveler, and in the stories, skills, and changes they brought back with them. For some, the road was a chapter in their life. For others, it was the thread running through the entire story. Either way, it left its mark, shaping not just the traveler but the people and places connected to them long after the journey had ended. When a medieval traveler returned home after weeks, months, or even years on the road, their journey did not simply end at the gates of their town or the door of their home. The effects of that journey often rippled outward, shaping not only the traveler's own future, but also the lives of their family, neighbors, and in some cases, entire communities. In a time when most people lived their whole lives within a small radius of where they were born, even one person's experience of the wider world could introduce changes that would echo for generations. For families, the most immediate impact of a traveler's return was often material. A merchant might bring back goods that were rare or entirely unknown in the local market, cloth from distant regions, spices that transformed the flavor of familiar dishes, or tools made with techniques not practiced in the area. These items could improve the family's status, comfort, or income. A single shipment of valuable goods might pay for a better home, more farmland, or apprenticeships for children. Over time, this could lift the entire family into a higher social standing, altering the opportunities available to their descendants. In other cases, the benefits were less tangible but just as influential. A traveler who had learned new farming techniques, carpentry methods, or ways to store food might share those skills with relatives and neighbors. In an era when knowledge was often as valuable as money, this information could improve the productivity of farms, the quality of tools, or the efficiency of trade within a community. The knowledge might be passed down quietly, absorbed into daily life so completely that, after a generation or two, no one remembered exactly where it had come from. Only that, we have always done it this way. Children of travelers often grew up with a different outlook from their peers. They heard stories about distant places, foreign customs, and strange landscapes that most of their neighbors could only imagine. This shaped their sense of what was possible. A child who knew that their parent had crossed mountains or sailed to far-off ports might see the world as larger and more connected than someone whose family had never traveled beyond the next village. In some cases, this inspired them to travel themselves, creating a cycle where each generation built on the experiences of the last. Marriage alliances were another area where travel left a long-term mark. Travelers frequently formed friendships and business relationships in other towns, and these connections could lead to marriages that brought new bloodlines, property, or alliances into the family. A marriage arranged with a partner from another region could expand a family's influence, open up new trade routes, or secure political support. Over time, these alliances could grow into powerful networks that shaped not just individual families, but entire regions. Travel also influenced the way communities saw themselves in relation to the wider world. In a small rural village, the return of a traveler was an event. People gathered to hear news, to see unfamiliar goods, and to listen to tales of life beyond the horizon. These stories became part of the village's collective memory. They gave people reference points for distant lands, introduced them to different customs, and sometimes even challenged long-held beliefs. Over generations, this slow drip of outside influence could make a community more adaptable, more open to trade, and more aware of events beyond their borders. Religious life, too, could be shaped by generational travel. A pilgrim who had journeyed to a famous shrine might inspire devotion at home, leading to the building of a small chapel or the introduction of new rituals. Children and grandchildren might grow up with these practices as a normal part of worship, never realizing that they were imported by a single journey decades earlier. Similarly, relics or icons brought back from travel could become treasured community possessions, symbols of protection or identity that lasted long after the original traveler was gone. Of course, not all generational impacts were positive. If a traveler failed to return, lost to bandits, illness, or misfortune, their family might suffer financially and emotionally for years. The absence of a main provider could lead to poverty, the selling of land, or the breaking up of households. Children might grow up hearing the story of their missing parent or relative, shaping their sense of caution about the dangers of the world. In some cases, the loss could make families less willing to allow future generations to travel, limiting their opportunities, but perhaps preserving their safety. In other cases, a traveler's experiences could introduce conflict within a community. New ideas about trade, religion, or governance could challenge established authority. If a returning traveler spoke too openly about practices in other regions, especially if those practices were more efficient or fair, it could create tension with local leaders. Over time, these tensions might shift power balances or cause social changes that no one could have predicted at the start of the journey. Generational impact also extended to the development of trade networks. A successful merchant route might be passed from parent to child, along with the contacts, knowledge, and strategies needed to keep it profitable. These routes could remain in the same family for decades, providing a steady source of wealth and influence. In this way, a single decision to brave a dangerous road could, over generations, transform a family from modest farmers into influential traders or landowners. Even when the original traveler's name was forgotten, their choices often left traces in family traditions, local customs, or the layout of a village's economy. A certain recipe might include spices no one grew locally. A particular style of roof might match those found in a distant town. A community might hold an annual fair at the same time of year that a traveler once returned home with a profitable shipment. These were subtle legacies, woven into daily life so completely that they no longer felt like imports from somewhere else. In the end, the generational impact of medieval travel was about more than goods or stories. It was about the slow shaping of identity. Each journey left behind threads that were picked up by children, grandchildren, and neighbors, weaving them into a broader tapestry that connected the local to the distant, the present to the past. Roads might be dangerous, but for those willing to risk them, the rewards could outlast a lifetime, echoing in the lives of people who had never set foot beyond their own fields, but whose world was larger because someone before them had. The end of a medieval journey was rarely a single dramatic moment. It was not like the turning of a page in a book or the lowering of a curtain in a play. More often, it was a gradual return, a slow transition from the constant motion and uncertainty of the road to the familiar rhythms of home. A traveler might not even realize the journey was truly ending until they caught sight of something unmistakably familiar, a particular bend in the road, the outline of a church steeple, the smell of a hearth fire drifting from a known street. In that moment, the dangers, hardships, and small victories of the road began to take on the weight of memory, rather than immediate concern. For many, the final days before arriving home were some of the most exhausting. Supplies were often running low, clothing was worn and travel-stained, and the fatigue of weeks or months of vigilance was catching up with them. Even though the worst dangers might be behind, the traveler remained cautious until the very last stretch. Bandits, illness, or an accident could still undo everything. The relief of seeing home was often tempered by the lingering habit of scanning the surroundings for threats. Approaching a town or village often meant passing through checkpoints, toll gates, or guard posts. This could be both a comfort and a frustration. On the one hand, a guarded gate meant the safety of a settled place. On the other, it could mean questions, inspections, or payments before entry. Travelers returning with goods had to account for what they carried. Merchants might need to declare their wares and pay duties, while pilgrims might be asked about relics or offerings they brought back. For ordinary travelers, this final hurdle was simply another reminder that the journey did not truly end until they were back inside their own doors. Once home, there was a period of adjustment. The body, accustomed to constant movement, sometimes felt restless. The mind, trained to stay alert, could take days or weeks to fully relax. Sleep might come more easily in a real bed, but some travelers found the silence strange after months of nights broken by the sounds of animals, wind, or distant voices. Eating familiar food again could be both comforting and unsettling, especially if one had grown used to the flavors of other regions. Family reunions could be emotional. Loved ones who had feared for the traveler's safety were relieved, sometimes tearfully so. Stories were told in bursts, fragments of the road, strange encounters, close escapes. But after the initial excitement faded, the details of the journey often became harder to share. Those who had stayed behind might not fully grasp what it felt like to walk for days through unfamiliar forests, to bargain for safe passage with someone whose language you barely understood, or to feel the cautious relief of finding an inn after dark in a strange town. Merchants returning with goods had work to do almost immediately. Warehouses needed to be stocked, items displayed, accounts settled, and profits calculated. The end of the physical journey was often the start of weeks of work to sell what had been brought back. Pilgrims might offer tokens or relics to their local church, fulfilling vows made on the road. Messengers might deliver important letters or verbal reports before they could rest. For many travelers, arrival was less about stopping and more about shifting from the work of the road to the work of home. There was also the matter of settling debts and obligations. A traveler who had borrowed money, supplies, or equipment for the journey needed to repay them. Promises made before leaving, whether to bring back goods, deliver messages, or carry news, had to be honored. In some cases, gifts were distributed to show gratitude to those who had helped make the journey possible, from family members who managed affairs in their absence to friends who had offered supplies or introductions. The end of a journey was also a time for taking stock. This meant more than counting profits or measuring success. Travelers often reflected on what had gone right, what had gone wrong, and what they had learned. These lessons shaped future decisions, whether they would travel again, how they would prepare differently, which routes they would avoid, and whom they would trust. The road had a way of leaving its mark, not just in physical weariness, but in changed priorities and sharpened judgment. For some, the end of a journey marked the start of a long period of staying close to home. The dangers faced, the losses endured, or simply the satisfaction of having achieved a goal might make them reluctant to leave again. Others, however, felt the pull of the road almost immediately. They unpacked their goods, told their stories, and already began to plan for the next departure. The experience of surviving one dangerous journey often made future ones seem more manageable, even if the risks remained the same. In the weeks after returning, the travelers' stories would spread. They might be repeated in taverns, markets, and at gatherings. Some would be told exactly as they happened. Others would grow in the telling, becoming local legends. A tense encounter with suspicious guards might become a near escape from arrest. A long day without food might turn into a dramatic tale of survival against the odds. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories served a purpose. They reminded others of the reality of the road, both its dangers and its possibilities. Eventually, the journey would settle into memory. The aches and fatigue faded. The goods brought back were sold, eaten, or stored away. The traveler resumed the routines of home life, but with the quiet knowledge that they had gone beyond familiar boundaries and returned. That knowledge lingered, shaping how they looked at the world and at themselves. The end of the journey, in truth, was not a complete ending. It was the point at which one chapter of a life closed, leaving the traveler to decide whether the next one would be written at home or somewhere far beyond the horizon. And so, when we look back at the world of medieval travel, it becomes clear that every mile covered was far more than just a physical distance crossed. For those who lived during those centuries, the road was not an abstract idea. It was a living, unpredictable reality that could test skill, patience, endurance, and even the bonds between people. A journey was not simply a matter of leaving one place and arriving at another. It was a slow unfolding of challenges and choices, each step bringing the traveler deeper into a realm where planning and adaptability mattered as much as luck. The roads of the medieval world were lined with uncertainty. Even the most prepared traveler could find themselves delayed by weather, stopped by toll collectors, or forced to alter their path because of bandits or political disputes. But just as often, the road offered moments of cooperation and humanity, strangers sharing bread at a roadside fire, a fellow traveler pointing out a safer ford across a river, a farmer offering shelter from a sudden storm. These moments did not erase the dangers, but they did make survival possible. Over time, these countless journeys, whether they ended in triumph, tragedy, or quiet return, shaped the people who took them. They learned not only how to keep themselves alive, but also how to read the unspoken signals of the road. The way a horse shifted its weight before bolting, the sound of cartwheels that carried too quietly to be friendly, the subtle difference between a watchman doing his duty and a man looking for a bribe. This knowledge, passed on through stories, advice, and shared warnings, became a kind of invisible map layered over the physical one, guiding future travelers who might never meet the original storytellers but who benefited from their experience. When a traveler came home, the impact of their journey often reached far beyond their own household. A single safe return could bring new goods, ideas, or connections that changed the rhythm of a village. Techniques for storing grain longer, methods for building sturdier roofs, or news of distant markets could slowly transform a community's fortunes. Sometimes these changes were subtle, woven into daily life so gradually that no one thought of them as foreign. At other times they were visible and immediate, as when a rare spice or finely made cloth caused a stir at the market. For the traveler, returning home was its own kind of challenge. After weeks or months of constant motion and alertness, settling into stillness could feel unfamiliar. The habits of the road, watching every shadow, listening for footsteps behind, keeping belongings close, did not disappear overnight. But gradually, as days passed and routines returned, the tension eased. What had been the pressing concerns of yesterday became memories, sometimes shared in vivid detail, sometimes left unspoken. And yet, the end of one journey was rarely the final word. Some would find themselves drawn back to the road, unable to resist the pull of the unknown. Others, satisfied with what they had achieved, might never again leave the safety of home. But whether they went out once or many times, the lessons of the road stayed with them. They knew how quickly conditions could change, how easily plans could be disrupted, and how survival often depended on small, timely decisions. The medieval road, in all its danger and unpredictability, demanded more than strength or wealth. It demanded awareness, patience, and the ability to adapt without losing sight of the destination. Those who survived it had faced something that could not be fully explained to those who had never traveled it. They carried with them a quiet knowledge that the world was larger, more complex, and more connected than life inside the village walls might suggest. Today, it is easy to imagine the medieval traveler only as a figure in a story, someone moving through a distant time, clad in rough clothes, leading a mule or riding a worn horse. But for them, the road was as real and immediate as our own daily paths. The clatter of hooves, the rattle of cartwheels, the smell of damp earth after rain, and the constant awareness that the next bend might bring friend or foe were the fabric of their reality. And so, the story of how medieval travelers survived dangerous roads is not just a tale of hardship. It is also a story of persistence, of resourcefulness, and of the countless small choices that meant the difference between reaching a destination and never returning at all. It is about the way those who braved the road shaped their own lives and the lives of those who came after. The roads may be different now, but the essence of the journey, the blend of risk, reward, and the need to navigate both the world and human nature remains much the same. In the end, for the medieval traveler, survival was never just about reaching the end of the road. It was about carrying something back, whether that was goods to sell, knowledge to share, or simply the experience of having faced the unknown and returned. And in the quiet after the journey, when the pack was finally set down and the fire burned low, there was a simple truth that needed no words. They had made it home.